The heat was a living thing. It pressed against the grimy windows of the passenger car, a shimmering, malevolent presence that distorted the vast emptiness of the New Mexico territory. Dust, fine as ground bone, coated everything: the worn velvet of the seats, the brass fittings of the lamps, the inside of a man's throat. It was the taste of the land itself, dry, patient, and unforgiving. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the iron rails was the only sound, a monotonous heartbeat counting away the miles, each one a small death to the past. Click-clack, click-clack, a funeral dirge for a life left behind. At the very back of the car, where the shadows clung thickest, sat Calder Boone. He was a tall man, built with the kind of lean, hard strength that comes from years of wrestling with the land and losing as often as winning. His shoulders were broad enough to block the window entirely, and he sat with a stillness that was less about peace and more about containment, as if any sudden movement might unleash something he had fought long and hard to cage. His face, etched by sun and wind, was a map of places he'd rather forget. A strong jaw was covered in the dark stubble of a few days' growth, and his mouth was a straight, unyielding line. But it was his eyes that held the truth of him. They were the color of a stormy sky, and they stared out at the passing blur of sagebrush and ochre rock without really seeing any of it. He was looking inward, at the smoldering ruins of a place he had once called home. He had left with nothing but the clothes on his back, the Colt Peacemaker heavy on his hip, and a saddlebag that held little more than a handful of cartridges, some jerky, and the ghost of a woman's laugh. He was running, though he'd never admit it. A cowboy didn't run. He moved on. He sought new horizons, but the words were just pretty paint on a rotten fence post. He was running from the silence of an empty ranch house, from the accusing stare of a sky that had watched him fail. He was leaving the part of his soul he had tried to plant in that cursed soil, leaving it to wither under the same relentless sun that now baked the roof of the train. The other passengers were ghosts to him, a family huddled together several rows ahead, the mother fanning a fretful child with a tattered piece of card, a salesman with a slicked-down haircut and a nervous twitch in his eye, who kept polishing his spectacles as if hoping to see a better world through them. They were all trapped in their own small orbits of misery or boredom, their presence no more significant than the flies buzzing lazily in the oppressive air. The car was an iron casket rattling through purgatory, and Calder was content to be its most solitary mourner. Then the door at the far end of the car crashed open. It wasn't pushed or swung, it was thrown, as if by a gale-force wind, slamming against the interior wall with a crack that made the salesman jump and the baby wail. For a moment, the opening framed a rectangle of blinding, incandescent light. A blast of furnace-hot air and a fresh cloud of dust swept through the car, carrying the scent of creosote and raw fear. Silhouetted against the glare was a figure, slight and desperate. She stumbled inside, pulling the heavy door shut behind her, the latch catching with a final, metallic sob. The light returned to the dim, dusty normal, and the passengers could see her clearly. She was young, perhaps not yet 20. Her dress, once a pale calico, was torn at the hem and stained with dirt and sweat. Her hair, the color of sun-dried straw, had escaped its pins and hung in wild, tangled strands around a face that was pale beneath a layer of grime. But it wasn't her disheveled state that held the attention. It was her eyes, wide and the color of a spring sky. They were filled with a terror so profound it seemed to suck all the air from her immediate vicinity. She scanned the car, her chest heaving with ragged, shallow breaths, her gaze darting from one face to the next like a cornered animal searching for an escape that didn't exist. The salesman stared, his mouth slightly agape. The mother pulled her child closer, shielding her from the spectacle. No one offered a hand, a word, a look of compassion. She was an intrusion, a messy, frantic disruption to their shared, quiet suffering. Her panic was a contagious disease, and they instinctively recoiled from it. Her wild eyes swept the car one last time, dismissing the other passengers as useless. Their faces closed and shuddered. And then she saw Calder. He hadn't moved a muscle. He just sat there in the shadows of the rear bench, a mountain of quiet indifference. Perhaps it was his isolation that drew her, the fact that he was set apart from the others. Or perhaps it was his size, the sheer solidness of him that promised an anchor in her storm. She took a hesitant step toward him, then another. The floorboards creaked under her worn boots. She moved with a strange, broken grace, her body trembling so violently he could see the fabric of her dress shake. When she reached his seat, she stopped, her breath catching in a sound that was half whimper, half plea. He didn't turn his head, but his gaze shifted, his storm-gray eyes meeting her sky-blue ones. He saw the raw, primal fear in them, a fear that went beyond being lost or alone. This was the fear of the hunted. He'd seen it in the eyes of a deer just before the wolf closes in. She didn't have the breath for a full sentence. Her voice was a dry, rasping whisper, barely audible over the noise of the train. "Please," she breathed, her hands twisting together in a knot of desperation. "Mister, please." Calder remained silent. His face was an unreadable mask of stone. He offered no encouragement, no sign of pity. He just watched her, his expression betraying nothing of the debate raging within him. He was a man trying to shed connections, to become an island. He wanted no part of anyone's trouble. He had enough of his own to drown in. Helping her would mean entanglement. It would mean trouble finding him, and trouble was the one thing he was riding this train to escape. She seemed to read the refusal in his stillness. A fresh wave of despair washed over her face, her shoulders slumping, her eyes welled with tears she refused to let fall. She took a tiny, shuddering breath, as if to turn and run, though there was nowhere left to go. But in that last, desperate moment, her eyes locked with his again, and she laid everything bare in that single look, all her fear, all her hopelessness, a silent scream for help. Something shifted in Calder. It was a faint, almost imperceptible flicker deep inside him, an old instinct he thought he had buried for good, the instinct to protect, to stand between the wolf and the lamb. It was the same damned instinct that had cost him everything. He cursed it, cursed her for finding it, cursed the world for putting her in his path. But he couldn't ignore it. It was woven into the very fiber of his being. With a sigh so quiet it was lost in the train's rhythm, he made his decision. He didn't speak. Words were clumsy, useless things. Instead, he simply moved. His left arm, which had been resting on the window ledge, rose with his thumb and forefinger. He took the edge of his duster, a heavy canvas coat, stiff with trail dust and smelling faintly of leather, sweat, and wood smoke, and lifted it, creating a dark, cavernous space between his body and the fabric. It was an invitation, nothing more. For a second, the girl, Ivy, just stared, her mind struggling to comprehend the gesture. Then understanding dawned, and with it, a surge of desperate gratitude that was painful to watch. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled forward, ducking her head and squeezing into the narrow space on the bench beside him. She was smaller than he'd thought, her frame almost bird-like. She pressed herself against the hard wall of his side, tucking her knees up and pulling her head down. Calder let the heavy coat fall, draping it over her until she disappeared completely. From the outside, it looked as though he had merely shifted his position, his coat now bunched up beside him. He rested his arm on top of the lump, his large, calloused hand spread wide, the weight of it stilling the violent tremors that shook her body. Under the stifling darkness of the coat, the world was reduced to sensation. For Ivy, it was a sudden, shocking intimacy. The air was thick with the scent of him, dust, leather, and something else. Something uniquely male, like pine and earth. She could feel the solid, unyielding muscle of his ribs and thigh through the thin fabric of her dress. The steady, slow beat of his heart thudded against her ear. a rhythm that was a stark contrast to the frantic hammering in her own chest. It was a terrifyingly vulnerable position, entrusting her life to the smell and feel of a complete stranger. But the darkness was a sanctuary. It was safety. For the first time in days, she wasn't exposed. She wasn't running. She was hidden. For Calder, it was an unwelcome intrusion. He could feel the slightness of her, the sharp bones of her shoulder and hip pressing against him. Her panicked breaths were hot against his side. He felt the frantic beat of her heart as if it were his own. He was acutely aware of her fragility, of the soft tangle of her hair brushing against his shirt. He had spent so long building walls around himself, and in one desperate moment, this slip of a girl had breached them all, burrowing into his space, forcing her terror and her life into his hands. He gritted his teeth, his gaze fixed on the endless, indifferent horizon. The weight of his arm over her felt heavier than it should. No longer just a limb but a promise he hadn't asked to make and already regretted. The train rattled on, carrying its cargo of lost souls across the burning plains. In the shadowed corner of the last car, a man who wanted to be alone and a girl who was desperately afraid of it were pressed together, two separate solitudes colliding under the shelter of a dusty coat. The world outside didn't know they were there, a tiny, shared secret in the vast, uncaring wilderness. They hadn't exchanged names. They hadn't exchanged a single word beyond her whispered plea. But in the suffocating heat and the shared darkness, a silent pact had been forged. He was her protector. She was his burden. And the train continued its relentless journey west, pulling them both toward a future that was as blank and menacing as the desert landscape. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels had become a strange sort of lullaby, a sound to anchor the terrified silence beneath the heavy coat. Tucked against the unyielding wall of the stranger's body, Ivy felt the vibrations travel through him and into her, a steady, mechanical pulse in the vast, trembling chaos of her fear. The darkness was hot and smelled of dust and man, but it was a world away from the judging eyes in the passenger car. For a few precious minutes, she allowed herself to believe she was invisible, a ghost haunting the space between two heartbeats. His hand remained on her back, a warm, heavy weight that was both a comfort and a cage. It did not move, did not offer a soothing stroke, yet it kept the worst of her shivers at bay. It was the hand of a man accustomed to holding reins, not a trembling girl. There was no gentleness in it, only a profound and steady strength. She listened to the slow, even cadence of his breathing and tried to match her own to it, a desperate attempt to borrow a calm she could not manufacture herself. The peace, fragile as a desert mirage, was shattered by the same sound that had heralded her own arrival. The car door at the opposite end flew open, but this time it was not with the frantic weakness of a fugitive. It was kicked open with a booted foot, slamming against its stop with a crack of splintering wood that echoed like a gunshot. Ivy flinched violently, a choked gasp escaping her lips. The hand on her back pressed down, not hard, but with an undeniable, silencing pressure. "Be still." The command was transmitted without a word. Heavy, purposeful footsteps entered the car. Two distinct sets. They moved with the confident, unhurried tread of predators who know their prey is trapped. The low murmur of the other passengers died instantly, replaced by a thick, anxious silence. The only sounds were the unrelenting click-clack of the train and the confident stride of the newcomers. "We're looking for something," a voice said. It was smooth, almost pleasant, but with an undercurrent of cold metal that scraped along the nerves. "Something that belongs to my employer. A girl, young, blonde hair, looks like a startled rabbit, carrying a leather satchel she has no right to possess. Anyone seen her?" Silence. The air in the car grew thick enough to choke on. Ivy felt the blood drain from her face, a cold dread seeping into her bones. She could picture him, the one who spoke. His name was Fletcher. He was the one, her so-called husband, a man of cruel appetites and considerable influence, sent to retrieve his property. Fletcher didn't use his fists. He used his voice and the chilling intelligence in his eyes. peeling a person apart layer by layer until all their secrets were bare. Nobody, Fletcher's voice was laced with mock disappointment. That's a shame. A real shame. My associate here, Mr. Grimes, gets awfully impatient when people aren't helpful. The second set of footsteps moved. Heavier, slower, a grunt. More animal than human. That would be Grimes. A hulking brute of a man whose knuckles were permanently scarred and whose mind held only one thought at a time. Usually one of violence. Maybe we ought to persuade them. Grimes rumbled, his voice a gravelly counterpoint to Fletcher's silk. Under the coat, Ivy's world had shrunk to the terrifying sounds from outside and the solid presence of the man beside her. She could feel his body tense, the muscles in his side hardening like oak. He hadn't moved an inch, but the very quality of his stillness had changed. It was no longer passive or weary. It was coiled, watchful, the lethal stillness of a panther gathering itself to spring. The footsteps started down the aisle, slow, deliberate. Ivy imagined their eyes, cold and assessing, sweeping over every passenger, dissecting every flicker of fear. She heard the frightened bleat of the salesman. I haven't seen anyone, I swear it. Of course you haven't. Fletcher's voice oozed false sympathy. Closer now. You look like an honest man. The footsteps continued their methodical advance. They stopped by the woman and her child. The baby, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, began to cry again. A thin, terrified wail. Ma'am, Fletcher said, his voice dropping into a register of feigned politeness. A pretty child. It would be a pity if she were frightened. All you have to do is tell me if you saw a girl run through here. Ivy could hear the mother's ragged, tearful whisper. She went to the back. A bolt of pure ice shot through Ivy's veins. Betrayed. Not out of malice, but out of simple, understandable fear. The hand on her back pressed down again. Harder this time. Stay, still. The footsteps resumed their march. Closer. Closer! Each heavy tread on the floorboards was a hammer blow against Ivy's heart. They were only a few rows away now. She held her breath, convinced they could hear the frantic drumming in her chest. She could smell the cheap cigar smoke that always clung to Grimes, a scent that would forever be linked in her mind with fear and pain. Calder did not look at them. His gaze remained fixed on the passing landscape, his face a mask of disinterest. He appeared to be a man half asleep, lulled by the motion of the train. A large, insignificant obstacle at the end of the car, but beneath the surface, every nerve was firing. He catalogued the train's speed, the gentle sway of the car. He noted the position of the emergency door just a few feet away. He felt the frantic, bird-like terror of the girl hidden against him, and weighed it against the cold menace in the approaching voices. He had wanted no part of this, but they had brought their hunt to him, and in doing so, they had crossed a line. Well now, what have we here? Fletcher's voice was right beside them, conversational and deadly. A man who likes his privacy. Calder didn't respond. He didn't even turn his head. He continued to watch the desert stream by. My associate asked you a question. Grimes growled, his voice a physical presence that seemed to suck the air from the space around them. Calder could feel the man's shadow fall over him. Slowly, as if rousing himself from a deep sleep. Calder turned his head. He looked past Fletcher's lean, watchful face and directly at the hulking form of Grimes. He didn't say a word. His storm-gray eyes were flat, empty of fear or anger, empty of everything but a cold, hard finality. It was a look that Grimes, who dealt in intimidation, had seen before, but usually only in the moments before a gun was drawn. It gave him a moment's pause. Fletcher's sharp eyes, however, missed nothing. They took in Calder's formidable size, the worn holster on his hip, and the unusually large, bunched-up duster beside him. A flicker of suspicion, sharp and intelligent, lit his gaze. "That's a heavy coat for a day like this," Fletcher observed, his voice soft. He took a half-step closer. "You hiding something under there, Cowboy." This was it. The moment the string ran out, Calder felt the girl Ivy go utterly rigid against him. He knew that in another second, her terror would betray them. Fletcher's hand started to move, reaching for the edge of the canvas. In that frozen sliver of time, Calder acted. There was no thought, only pure, decisive instinct. His left arm, the one covering Ivy, shot out and clamped around her waist, pulling her from the bench and against his chest in one fluid, powerful motion. Simultaneously, he exploded upwards, using the raw power in his legs to launch himself off the seat. It was a move of such startling speed and violence that both Fletcher and Grimes were taken completely by surprise. Fletcher's hand, reaching for the coat, found only empty air. Grimes grunted, stumbling back a step. Calder didn't spare them a glance, holding Ivy tight against him as a shield and a burden, her face pressed into his shoulder. He took 2 long, driving strides toward the side door of the car. He kicked the latch with his boot, a single, sharp impact that sent the door flying open. For a heartbeat, they were framed in the opening, a silhouette of a man and a woman against a backdrop of blinding sun and blurring earth. The roar of the wind and the grinding shriek of the wheels filled the car. The other passengers gasped. Behind them, Fletcher was already drawing his pistol, his face a mask of fury and surprise. There was no time. Calder didn't hesitate. He tightened his grip on the girl, tucking her head down with his hand, and threw himself out into the void. The world became a maelstrom of violent sensation. The air was a solid wall that tore the breath from their lungs. The roar of the train was deafening. Then suddenly, it was gone, replaced by the scream of the wind in their ears. They were airborne for a dizzying, terrifying second, suspended between the iron beast and the hard, waiting earth. Calder twisted his body mid-air, a desperate, instinctive maneuver to ensure he would take the brunt of the landing. They hit the ground not on the flat, but on the downward slope of a sandy embankment. The impact was brutal. It drove the air from Calder's lungs in a pained gasp. He held onto Ivy with grim tenacity, his arms a cage of iron around her as they began to tumble. The world dissolved into a chaotic, spinning blur of blue sky and yellow earth. They rolled end over end, a tangle of limbs and desperation. The sand was an abrasive force, tearing at their clothes, scraping their skin raw. Prickly desert shrubs whipped at them, leaving stinging cuts. Calder felt a sharp, searing pain in his shoulder as it connected with a rock hidden just beneath the surface of the sand. He grunted, his grip on Ivy faltering for a second before tightening again. He could hear her small, terrified cries, muffled against his chest. Finally, their chaotic momentum slowed, and they slid to a stop at the bottom of the embankment in a heap of bruised limbs and exhaustion. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. The profound, ringing silence of the desert rushed in to fill the space where the train's roar had been. The sun beat down with a physical, punishing force. The air was still and scorching. In the distance, the train was already shrinking, a black line of smoke, its only epitaph as it disappeared toward the horizon. Calder lay on his back, gasping for breath, the world slowly swimming back into focus. A sharp, throbbing pain radiated from his shoulder, and a dozen other aches were beginning to make themselves known. The girl was a heavy, trembling weight on top of him. He could feel her shuddering breaths, the frantic beat of her heart against his ribs. Slowly, he loosened his grip. "You can get up now," he rasped, his voice raw. Ivy pushed herself up, her movements clumsy and weak. She was covered in sand, her dress was torn in new places, and a long, bloody scratch ran down her forearm. She stared at him, her eyes wide with shock and a dawning horror. Then she looked around, at the endless, shimmering expanse of sand and rock that stretched in every direction, meeting a sky that was a vast and empty bowl of blue. There was nothing. No water, no shelter, No sign of life, only the oppressive sun and the deafening silence. She looked back at the fading smoke of the train, their last link to civilization, and then at the raw, scraped skin on her hands. They were alive. They were free. But as she stood there, trembling and exposed under the cruel desert sun, she understood the terrifying truth of their situation. The escape was not over. It had only just begun. For a time, the only movement was the shimmering dance of heat above the baked earth. The silence was a physical weight, pressing down, broken only by Ivy's ragged, shallow breaths. She stood swaying, a creature of torn cloth and raw nerves marooned in an ocean of rock and sun. Calder pushed himself to a sitting position, his face a grim mask as a jolt of pain shot through his shoulder. He ignored it, his gaze sweeping the horizon with a slow, methodical assessment that missed nothing. He noted the angle of the sun, the shape of the distant mesas, the almost imperceptible lines of a dry wash cutting through the flats 100 yards away. He rose to his feet in a single, fluid motion that belied his injuries. He looked at Ivy, truly looked at her for the first time since she had stumbled into his life. He saw not just the fear, but the exhaustion that was beginning to pull her down, the shock that was making her tremble. He knew that if they stayed here, exposed in the open, they were already dead. The desert would kill them long before Fletcher and Grimes could. "Get up," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, a sound that seemed to fit the harsh landscape. It wasn't a request. Ivy flinched at the sound, but she obeyed, her legs unsteady. He didn't offer a hand. He simply turned and started walking toward the shallow depression of the arroyo, his stride long and deceptively easy. Ivy stumbled after him, her mind a numb buzz of disbelief. The man who had thrown himself from a moving train to save her now wouldn't even offer a word of comfort. The arroyo offered little respite from the sun, but its winding, sandy bottom kept them below the level of the surrounding plain, hiding them from distant eyes. The walking was harder here, the loose sand stealing their energy with every step. For Calder, it was a familiar hardship. He moved with a relentless economy of motion, his eyes constantly scanning the banks above, his body a study in grim purpose. For Ivy, it was a special kind of hell. Her flimsy boots filled with sand, and the raw scrape on her arm throbbed in the heat. Thirst was a claw in her throat, and soon, every step was a conscious, painful effort. She didn't complain. She didn't dare. There was something about the man's unyielding silence that forbade weakness. He walked ahead, a solitary, determined figure, and her only option was to follow in his footsteps, focusing on the back of his dusty coat as if it were the only fixed point in a spinning world. She began to understand that his silence wasn't cruelty. It was a tool, a way of preserving the energy and focus needed to fight the relentless adversary that was the desert itself. After what felt like an eternity, when Ivy was certain she could not take another step, he stopped. He stood at a place where the arroyo wall rose into a jumble of weathered red rock, a chaotic pile of boulders and slabs that looked as if they had been tossed there by a careless giant. He pointed toward a narrow, almost invisible fissure between two massive stones. "In there." It was less a cave and more a deep, shadowed recess. The entrance was narrow, forcing them to turn sideways to squeeze through, but it opened into a small, enclosed space, perhaps 10 feet deep and half as wide. The air inside was still and blessedly cool, the stone walls leaching the heat from their aching bodies. High above, a sliver of brilliant blue sky was visible, but here on the sandy floor, they were wrapped in a dim, peaceful twilight. It was a sanctuary, a breath held against the crushing weight of the sun. Ivy sank to the ground, her back against a smooth, cool wall of rock, and closed her eyes. The relief was so profound it was almost painful. She listened to the sound of her own frantic pulse gradually slowing. Calder did not rest. She heard him moving, the soft scuff of his boots on the sand. She opened her eyes to see him rummaging through his saddlebag. He produced a small, battered tin canteen, and a strip of dried meat. He handed both to her. "Just a sip," he commanded, his voice low in the enclosed space. "And chew on this slowly." The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. It eased the claw in her throat, and she had to fight the desperate urge to gulp it all down. She did as he said, taking only a small sip before handing it back. He took an equally sparing drink himself before capping it. The jerky was tough and salty, but as she worked at it, she felt a small measure of strength return to her limbs. He watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable, before turning his attention back to the outside. He disappeared through the narrow entrance. Panic flared in Ivy's chest. Was he leaving her? She scrambled to the opening and peered out. He hadn't gone far. He was moving along the base of the rock formation, his head down, gathering handfuls of a specific kind of dry, brittle weed and clumps of sun-scorched grass. He worked with a quiet efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch. Once he had a sizable bundle. He didn't return. Instead, he walked away from their shelter, back out into the arroyo and then up onto the open plain, moving north, in a direction almost perpendicular to the path they had taken. Ivy watched, confused, as he walked a few hundred yards until he was just a dark shape in the shimmering heat. He knelt, and a moment later, she saw a thin tendril of smoke rise into the still air. It wasn't a large fire. He wasn't trying to signal for help. The smoke was pale and wispy, designed to mimic a small campfire that had been burning for some time. It would rise, catch the faint breeze, and drift lazily eastward. Anyone following their trail from the train tracks would see the smoke in the distance. They would assume the fugitives were over there, resting, careless. They would be drawn to the false trail, wasting precious hours while Calder and Ivy moved in the opposite direction. As Ivy watched the smoke drift away, a profound realization settled over her. This man, this stranger, was a different kind of creature than anyone she had ever known. He thought in terms of wind direction, terrain, and deception. He didn't react to danger. He anticipated it. His mind was a map of survival, and every silent action he took was a deliberate step along its path. The jump from the train hadn't been a moment of blind panic. It had been a calculated risk. The walk through the arroyo, the choice of this specific shelter, the false fire, it was all part of a plan that existed solely in his head. And it was all for her. He was doing this to protect her. The thought was staggering. In her life, men had only ever been a source of danger or disappointment. Her father, lost in a haze of whiskey and self-pity, had seen her as a commodity. The man he'd arranged for her to marry saw her as a possession, a pretty thing to be owned and controlled. They took this man, for reasons she couldn't possibly fathom. He had given her sanctuary under his coat. He had given her a chance at freedom at the risk of his own life. And now, he was giving her his skill, his focus, his silent, unconditional protection. He returned as quietly as he had left, slipping back into the cool darkness of their recess. He settled against the opposite wall, his long legs stretched out, and finally allowed himself a moment of rest. He pulled a knife from his belt and began meticulously cleaning the sand from the action of his Colt, the soft clicks of the metal the only sound in their shelter. The sun began its slow descent, and the light filtering down into their hiding place softened from harsh white to a warm, dusty gold. A fragile peace settled between them. It was a peace born not of comfort, but of shared isolation, a temporary truce in their war against the world outside. For the first time, Ivy felt a flicker of something other than fear. It was a deep, aching curiosity. She looked at the man across from her, at his strong, calloused hands working on the pistol, at the deep lines of exhaustion and pain etched around his eyes, at the stubborn set of his jaw. He was a fortress, silent and impenetrable, but she had been allowed inside its walls, and she felt a desperate need to know the name of her keeper. "I'm Ivy," she said, her voice soft, tentative. He didn't look up from his work. He simply nodded once, a bare acknowledgement that he had heard her. She waited, but he offered nothing in return. The silence stretched, and she gathered her courage. "What should I call you?" He paused his work, the cylinder of the revolver resting in his palm. He lifted his head, and his storm-gray eyes met hers. They were clear and direct, holding no malice, only an unshakable, world-weary pragmatism. He held her gaze for a long moment, the silence amplifying the weight of his coming words. "A name won't help you survive," he said. The words were not unkind, but they were absolute. They drew a line, a boundary she was not meant to cross. They told her everything she needed to know about him, that he was a man who had stripped his life down to its barest essentials. Identity, history, connection, these were luxuries. Food, water, shelter. Staying alive, this was the reality. His name was a piece of a past he was running from, a thing of no use in the stark, immediate present. Ivy fell silent, a flush of embarrassment warming her cheeks. She had tried to build a small bridge of humanity between them, and he had met her with a wall of pure, unadorned fact. Yet, strangely, she wasn't offended. She was in awe. She was in the presence of a man who lived by a code so Spartan, so completely divorced from the world she knew, that it was almost a form of purity. He wasn't just protecting her from the men who were hunting her. He was protecting her from the desert, from starvation, from her own ignorance. He was a guardian, and guardians did not need names. They only needed to be present. She nodded, accepting his terms. "All right," she whispered. He gave a single, curt nod in return and went back to cleaning his weapon. Ivy leaned her head back against the cool stone, watching the last of the daylight fade from the sliver of sky above. She didn't know his name. She didn't know where he was from or where he was going, but she knew the steady feel of his hand on her back, the resolve in his eyes, and the quiet competence of his every move. In the vast, howling wilderness of New Mexico, under the threat of death, that was more than enough. For now, they would simply be two souls hidden in the rocks, a girl with a name and a past, and a man who was only the promise of a future. They traveled by the moon, a sliver of bone-white crescent in an ink-black sky. The world was rendered in shades of silver and gray. The harsh edges of the desert softened into a landscape of ghosts. The man with no name moved through it as if he were one of them, a silent specter navigating by the constellations and the subtle contours of the land. He walked with the same relentless, energy-conserving pace, but now there was a new quality to it, a sense of direction, of heading not just away from danger, but towards something. Ivy followed, a smaller shadow in his wake. The grueling walk had stripped away the last of her panic, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep weariness. She moved automatically, her mind a quiet, empty space, focused only on the rhythmic scuff of his boots on the rocky ground ahead. The world had been reduced to this simple equation: he moved, she followed. He was her compass, her shield, the only solid thing in a universe that had dissolved into chaos. Thirst and hunger were a dull, constant ache, but the fear had receded, replaced by a strange, fatalistic trust. Just before the first hint of dawn, when the sky was a bruised purple and the stars were beginning to fade, he led her up the slope of a low mesa. When they reached the top, he stopped. Below them, nestled in a wide, shallow basin, lay a valley. It was a darker patch in the gloom, a place where shadows pooled, protected on three sides by the gentle rise of the surrounding hills. A lone, skeletal cottonwood tree stood sentinel near the center, its bare branches reaching for the sky like twisted fingers, and tucked beside it, almost invisible in the pre-dawn light, were the shapes of a small house and a corral. They were the first signs of human habitation she had seen since the train, yet they held no promise of welcome. The place looked abandoned, forgotten, a collection of geometric shadows slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. It had the profound stillness of a place where a life had ended. He started down the gentle slope, and she followed, her worn boots sliding on the loose scree. As they drew closer, the details emerged from the darkness. The house was made of adobe, its walls the color of the earth it came from, cracked and weathered by years of sun and neglect. The roof was canted at a sad angle, and the windows were dark, empty eyes staring out at nothing. The wooden posts of the corral fence were gray and splintered, some leaning at impossible angles, others fallen completely. It was a place of profound loneliness. He didn't go to the front door. He led her around to the back, to a heavy wooden door that groaned in protest as he pushed it open. The air that rushed out was stale and cool, thick with the scent of dust, dry wood, and the faintest, ghostly trace of wood smoke, a memory of fires long since extinguished. He stepped inside, and after a moment's hesitation, she followed him into the darkness. He moved with a familiarity that was jarring in the abandoned space, crossing to a shuttered window and pushing it open. A rectangle of pale gray light spilled into the room, illuminating a blizzard of dust motes. The room was a kitchen. It was Spartan, containing only a rough-hewn wooden table, 2 chairs, a dry sink, and a large, cast-iron stove, rusted in places but still solid. Everything was coated in a thick, uniform layer of dust, a soft gray blanket that softened all the hard edges. It looked less like a ruin and more like a room that had been put to sleep, waiting for someone to come and wake it up. He crossed the kitchen and pushed open another door, leading into the main room of the house. Here, the furniture, a simple bed frame, a small chest, a single rocking chair was covered with white cloths, making them look like pale, shrouded forms in the dim light. He walked to the center of the room and stood there for a long moment, not moving, just looking. Ivy stayed in the doorway, feeling like an intruder in a sacred, sorrowful place. He was no longer the silent, pragmatic survivor from the desert. Here, in this house, he was someone else, a man haunted by the ghosts that lived in the dust. Finally, he turned to her. The light from the kitchen window was behind him, casting his face in shadow, but she could hear the change in his voice. The hard, gravelly edge was gone, replaced by a quiet, weary resonance. "This place is my past," he said, the words falling strangely in the thick silence. He made a small gesture that took in the shrouded furniture, the dusty floors, the very air they were breathing. "It was mine. I was on that train to sell it, to be done with it." He paused, and she felt the weight of all the things he wasn't saying. "You can stay as long as you want. No one will look for you here." Ivy stared at him, the meaning of his words slowly settling over her. He was offering her not just a roof and walls, but a haven, a place to stop running. It was a gift of such magnitude she didn't know how to comprehend it. For the first time, he was offering her a piece of himself, not his name, but his history, the sorrowful, empty shell of his former life. It was a gesture of profound trust, and it left her speechless. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He seemed to take that as his answer. He gave one last look around the room, then turned and walked out, leaving her alone with the ghosts. For the rest of that day, he worked outside, his movements once again marked by that relentless, practical energy. He inspected the well, his silhouette a dark shape against the sky as he worked the hand pump. After a dozen noisy, grating strokes, a trickle of brown water emerged, then cleared, running clean and cool. The sound of it splashing into a bucket was the sound of life returning. Inside, Ivy began her own work. She felt a desperate, pressing need to do something, to repay his incredible kindness in the only way she knew how. She started in the kitchen. She found a broom, its bristles stiff and clogged with old cobwebs, and began to sweep. The dust rose in thick, choking clouds, the accumulation of seasons of neglect. As she swept, she felt as though she were clearing not just the floor, but her own mind. sweeping away the lingering cobwebs of fear and uncertainty. She found rags and, using the precious water he had drawn, began to wipe down the table and chairs. The simple, repetitive motion was soothing. With each swipe, she uncovered the grain of the wood, the nicks and scars of daily use. She was touching the life that had been lived here. She imagined hands placing dishes on this table, a family sharing a meal, their voices echoing faintly in the silence. Whose hands, whose voices she didn't know, but she felt their presence, and she treated the simple furniture with a reverence she couldn't explain. When the kitchen was clean, it was transformed. The morning sun, now streaming through the clean window pane, illuminated a space that was no longer a tomb, but simply a room, waiting. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. She moved into the main room and, one by one, removed the dust cloths. Beneath them, the furniture was plain but sturdy, made by hand with more care than skill. The bed frame was simple pine. The rocking chair was worn smooth on the arms, a testament to countless hours of use. As she folded the cloths, she felt an overwhelming sense of melancholy. This wasn't just a house. It was a home someone had loved enough to protect before they left. Her work gave the day a rhythm. While he was outside, mending the most broken sections of the corral fence with salvaged wood and old wire, she was inside, battling the dust and the silence. She beat the thin mattress until the air was thick with its dust, then dragged it outside to bake in the sterilizing heat of the sun. She found a small stash of tins and a pantry beans and dried peaches and a sack of flour, a small miracle of foresight from whoever had left. That evening, they ate at the clean kitchen table. It was their first real meal, a simple dish of beans heated on the iron stove, which Calder had cleared of debris and coaxed back to life. They ate in their now customary silence, but it was a different kind of silence. It was no longer the tense, watchful quiet of the trail. It was a softer, more domestic silence, filled with the crackle of the fire and the scrape of spoons against tin plates. After they ate, he took a whetstone from his saddlebag and began to sharpen his knife. The rhythmic shing, shing, shing of steel on stone, a calming, meditative sound. Ivy sat at the other end of the table, mending a tear in her dress with a needle and thread she'd found in a small sewing box. The flickering light of the single candle he had lit cast their shadows long and dancing on the clean adobe walls. They were two strangers, bound by circumstance, performing the simple, ancient rituals of making a home. In the days that followed, a routine began to form, as natural and unspoken as the rising and setting of the sun. He would work outside. His tasks focused on the fundamentals of survival, securing the water source, reinforcing the house, ensuring they had a supply of firewood. He was a man who knew how to coax life from a dying place. Ivy, in turn, claimed the inside of the house as her domain, but she found herself drawn to the outdoors, to the vast, quiet beauty of the valley. She started by gathering fallen branches from the cottonwood for the fire. Then, seeing the way Calder worked at the fences, she picked up a hammer and a handful of nails and began to secure loose boards on the small porch. Her work was clumsy, the nails often bending under her in expert blows. But it was hers. It was an act of creation, of repair. She was no longer the terrified girl from the train. The sun had browned her skin, and the hard work had brought a new strength to her hands. The constant fear had been replaced by a quiet watchfulness, an awareness of her surroundings. She was like a drought-starved plant that had finally found water. Her roots, tentative at first, were beginning to take hold in the unforgiving soil of this lonely valley. She was battered and scarred, a refugee from a violent storm. But here, in the strange, warm silence of this forgotten place, she was beginning to grow. The silence in the small adobe house had become a language of its own. It spoke in the soft crackle of the fire in the stove, the gentle scrape of Calder's knife on a piece of leather he was mending, the whisper of Ivy's needle through coarse fabric. In the weeks they had lived in the forgotten valley, This quiet had transformed from an empty, watchful thing into a vessel that could hold the weight of their unspoken histories. It was a silence built of shared meals, of tasks performed in tandem, of a mutual, undeclared pact to guard this fragile peace. Tonight, the quiet felt different. A storm was brewing far off in the mountains, and the air was heavy, charged with an expectant stillness. Ivy sat at the kitchen table, the light of a single tallow candle casting her shadow long against the wall. She wasn't sewing. Her hands lay still in her lap, her gaze fixed on a worn leather satchel tucked in the corner near the hearth. It was the one thing she had carried from her old life, the one thing she had managed to keep through the desperate flight and the tumble from the train. It sat there in the shadows, a dark, condensed piece of her past. Calder sat opposite her, working a beeswaxed thread through a split rein. He moved with his usual economy, his focus absolute. But he was a man who noticed everything the way a hawk circled. The shift in the wind, the tension in a silent room. He had seen her staring at the satchel for the better part of an hour, had seen the way her hands had begun to tremble. He finished his stitch, pulled it tight, and set the rein down on the table. He did not speak, but the cessation of his small, rhythmic movements was a question in itself. His storm-gray eyes met hers across the flickering candlelight, and in their depths, she saw not curiosity, but a patient, steady waiting. He was offering her the silence, a safe place to put her words if she chose to. And suddenly, the need to speak, to unburden herself of the story that had been lodged in her throat like a shard of glass, was overwhelming. "My PA," she began. Her voice was so soft it was nearly lost in the sound of the rising wind outside. "He was a good man, once, before the whiskey drank his soul." As she spoke, the simple kitchen seemed to fade, the flickering candle flame dissolving into the memory of gaslights in a too-quiet parlor. Her father had been a man of books and soft hands, a dreamer who never quite managed to bend the world to his will. After her mother passed, he had begun to fade. His grief a thirst that only whiskey could seem to quench. The farm had withered under his neglect, the fences falling into disrepair, the fields lying fallow. All they had left was the house and a name that was losing its luster. And they had Ivy. "He used to say I was his treasure," she whispered to Calder, her eyes seeing a parlor room, not a rustic kitchen. "I didn't realize he meant to sell me." The man who came to call was named Silas Thorne. He was not a neighbor, but a man from the city, a man whose wealth was a palpable force, evident in the fine wool of his suit and the cold, polished shine of his boots. He was older than her father, with a face that seemed carved from pale marble and eyes the color of a winter sky. He did not smile with his eyes, only with his mouth. "He spoke to my PA for hours," Ivy recalled. "I served them tea, and he never once looked at me like I was a person. He looked at me the way a man looks at a horse he's thinking of buying, checking the teeth, the fetlocks." The flashback was sharp, painful. She remembered standing by the door, listening. As the deal was struck, Thorne would settle her father's considerable debts, provide him with a generous stipend for the rest of his days. In exchange, Ivy would become Mrs. Silas Thorne. There was no discussion, no question of her consent. The handshake between the two men was the clang of a cage door swinging shut. Her father, his eyes glassy with drink and shame, could not meet her gaze. He had sold his treasure for a lifetime supply of whiskey and oblivion. "I became his property," she told Calder, her voice flat, devoid of the emotion that was churning inside her. "The day of the wedding, he gave me a jewelry box. He told me it was my duty to be the most beautiful object in his home. An object. That's all I was." Life in Silas Thorne's house was a study in suffocating perfection. It was a grand house, filled with dark, heavy furniture, thick carpets that swallowed all sound, and servants who moved like ghosts. Thorne gave her dresses of silk and lace, jewels that felt cold against her skin. He expected her to be seated in the parlor when he returned in the evenings, to preside over his silent, formal dinners, to be a flawless, silent testament to his prosperity. He was never overtly cruel in a way that would leave a mark. His cruelty was in the erasing of her. He would praise the color of her dress but interrupt her if she tried to speak an opinion. He would take her hand and comment on its delicacy, but ignore the book she was trying to read. She was a doll he placed just so, a canary in a gilded cage whose song he had no interest in hearing. Her life was measured in the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a moment of her soul draining away. He was a powerful man. Ivy continued, her gaze dropping to her own hands, now calloused and strong, so different from the soft, useless things they had been in Thorne's house. He owned half the county, but he built his fortune on rot. Out of sheer, soul-crushing boredom, she had begun to explore. The house was her prison, and she learned its every secret. Thorne had a study, a place she was forbidden to enter. But one day, while he was away on business, she found the spare key. The room was like him ordered, cold and filled with secrets, and in a locked drawer of his massive oak desk, she found them. Ledgers, contracts, deeds. She wasn't a businesswoman, but she could read. She saw names she recognized: local farmers, small ranchers who had suddenly lost their land to foreclosure or ruin. She saw their signatures on contracts, but they were wrong, shaky and strange. Then she found the other ledger, the real one, hidden beneath a false bottom in the drawer. It detailed a systematic campaign of fraud and extortion, forged documents, predatory loans, witness tampering. Silas Thorne wasn't a businessman. He was a spider, and his web covered everything. He had ruined dozens of families, taking their land, their water rights, their futures, all with the stroke of a pen. "It was all there," she said, her eyes finally lifting from her hands to look at the satchel in the corner. "The proof of it all, the real ledger, the forged deeds. I knew it was the only thing I had that was worth more to him than I was. It was my only way out." The memory of her escape was a frantic, heart-pounding blur. She waited for a moonless night, her heart hammering against her ribs so loudly she was sure the whole house could hear it. She dressed in the sturdiest clothes she had, a simple servant's dress. She filled the leather satchel with the ledgers and the most damning of the papers. Every creak of the floorboards was a gunshot in the silence. The tick of the hall clock was a drumbeat counting down to her doom. She had slipped out a back door, running across manicured lawns into the wild darkness of the woods beyond. She didn't look back. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out. Then she walked. She sold the last piece of jewelry Thorne had given her, a small pearl earring, for a pittance in a town far enough away that she thought she might be safe. It was enough for a train ticket, a ticket to anywhere. "I was on the run for 3 days before I got to that station," she told Calder, her voice now just a thread of sound. "I didn't sleep. I barely ate. Every face I saw was a threat. Every shadow held a monster. I knew he would send men, not just to bring back his wife, but to bring back what I had stolen. He couldn't let that proof get out." She finally looked at Calder, her eyes pleading for him to understand the depth of her despair in that moment. "By the time I got on that train, I was done. I was so tired of running, so tired of being afraid. I truly believed I was going to die. I thought I would either starve on the road or they would find me, and I almost didn't care which came first." Her story finally arrived at its destination, at the moment their lives had intersected. I was sitting there, trying to breathe, and the door opened, and I saw them, the man with the slick voice, Fletcher, and the other one. I knew they were his. I knew it was over. Her breath hitched. I was going to run, just bolt, but there was nowhere to go. My eyes were searching for anything, a miracle, an escape. And I saw you, at the back of the car. You looked so solid, like a mountain. I don't know what I thought. I just knew I had one last chance. I thought I would die on that train, but you lifted your coat." The story was finished. The words hung in the quiet room, fragile and raw. The kitchen was no longer a memory. It was a sanctuary again. The only sounds were the wind howling softly around the eaves and the steady crackle of the fire. Calder had not moved. His knife and the leather rein rested on the table. Forgotten. He sat with that profound stillness she had first seen on the train. But it was different now. It was not the stillness of indifference, but of deep listening. He looked at her, and for the first time, she felt he was truly seeing all the way to the bottom of her, past the fear and the dirt to the person she was. He didn't offer words of comfort. He didn't say, "It'll be all right." He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. Instead, he reached one large, calloused hand across the table. He didn't touch her. He just placed his hand, palm up, on the rough-hewn wood between them. It was an offering, a silent acknowledgement of every word she had spoken. It was a gesture that said, "I have heard you. I am here." And in that moment, Ivy understood that this silent man, this guardian without a name, had heard her story not with pity, but with a rare and solemn understanding. His simple, quiet presence was more comforting than all the words in the world. Sharing her story had changed the air between them. The confession, offered into the quiet of the kitchen, had not filled the silence with awkwardness, but had instead deepened it, transforming it into a shared territory. He had heard the worst of her past, and he had not fled. He had stayed. He had placed his hand on the table, a silent anchor in the storm of her memory. That single gesture had said more than 1,000 words of comfort. In the days that followed, a new, unspoken tenderness began to weave itself into the fabric of their routine, a delicate thread of caring that was visible only in the smallest of actions. The valley, which had at first seemed so desolate, began to reveal its secrets to Ivy. She learned to see the subtle beauty in its harshness. One morning, while searching for sturdy branches for a makeshift clothesline, she found it, tucked in the shade of a large, sun-bleached boulder. A single mariposa lily was in bloom. Its petals were a pale, creamy white, almost translucent, with a delicate, wine-colored stain at its base. It was a thing of impossible fragility and startling resilience, a perfect jewel born of the arid, unforgiving soil. To Ivy, the flower was a miracle. It was a reflection of the hope she was beginning to feel, a fragile, stubborn thing blooming in the shelter of the rocks. She knelt, studying it for a long moment before carefully plucking it, its stem thin and wiry in her fingers. She carried it back to the house, cupped in her palm as if it were a living flame. She didn't know what to do with it. Giving it to him felt too bold, too direct. It was a gesture that belonged to a world of sentiment they did not inhabit. So, she simply laid it on the worn wooden threshold of the front door, a silent, anonymous offering to the house, to the valley, to the quiet man who had given her this sanctuary. She felt a blush creep up her neck as she walked away, as if she had just confessed a profound secret. He would have seen it when he came in for the midday meal. He said nothing. He didn't acknowledge the flower, and it was gone from the doorstep. A small, foolish part of her felt a pang of disappointment. He had probably seen it as nothing more than a weed and tossed it aside. It was a silly, sentimental gesture, and he was a man who had no room for sentiment. She chided herself for it and pushed the thought away. 2 days later, she was sweeping the main room while he was outside checking a line of snares he had set in the hills. He had left a small, leather-bound book on the kitchen table. It was not a diary. She had seen it before. It was a book of notes, a ledger of his practical world. He would sometimes sketch in it the shape of an animal track, a map of the valley's water sources, the phases of the moon. As she passed the table, a breeze from the open window rustled the pages, and there, pressed carefully between a drawing of a hawk in flight and a list of edible desert plants, was her flower. Ivy froze, her hand gripping the broom handle. It was flattened now, its color preserved. every delicate vein visible. He hadn't thrown it away. He had kept it. He had taken her small, hopeful gesture and placed it inside the pages of his own life, preserving it alongside the things that mattered for survival. He had understood. The realization sent a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. She gently closed the book and backed away from the table, her heart beating a little faster. It was the first verse in a poem only the two of them could read. He began to answer in his own silent language. He noticed the way she would work through the hottest part of the day. Her face flushed and beaded with sweat as she stubbornly tried to cultivate a small patch of earth near the house for herbs. He saw her pause to press a hand to her back, her breath coming in short gasps. He said nothing, but the next afternoon, when she went to her small, struggling garden, a bucket of water was waiting for her in the shade of the cottonwood tree. It was fresh from the well, so cold that condensation beaded on the outside of the wooden bucket. A tin dipper rested on a clean cloth beside it. It was such a simple thing, but it was an act of profound observation. He had seen her need and met it without a word. It was his version of the flower on the doorstep, a practical offering of comfort, a quiet acknowledgement of her efforts. From then on, a bucket of cool water was always there when the sun was at its highest. It was a daily ritual, a promise kept without ever being made. She found her own way to reply. She saw the state of his clothes. He had few possessions, and the shirt he wore most often was a testament to a hard life. The fabric was worn thin across the shoulders, and a long, jagged tear near the sleeve was a reminder of their violent tumble from the train. It was a wound in the cloth that mirrored the scars he carried on his body, and, she suspected, on his soul. One evening, after he had gone outside to watch the sunset, a solitary ritual of his, she took the shirt from the hook where it hung. In the fading light, she sat in the rocking chair and, with a needle and thread from the small sewing box, she began to mend it. Her stitches were small and neat, a patient, careful line that closed the tear, reinforcing the weakened fabric. It was a slow, meditative process. With each pass of the needle, she felt as though she were mending something more than cloth. She was pouring her gratitude, her burgeoning affection, into the very fibers of the shirt. It was a way of caring for him, of trying to soothe a hurt she could not otherwise reach. She finished as darkness fell, folded the shirt neatly, and placed it back on the hook. The next morning, he came into the kitchen and reached for the shirt. He paused, his fingers brushing over the line of her stitches. He held it up for a moment, his back to her, examining her work in the pale morning light. He didn't turn. He didn't speak. He simply put the shirt on. The fit was unchanged, but Ivy knew it was different. Her care was now a part of it, a secret layer against his skin. His silent acceptance was his thank you. Their life was a tapestry woven from such quiet moments. He would leave a piece of dried fruit on the table for her. She would make sure the fire was burning warmly when he came in from the cold. He would clear the sharpest rocks from the path to the well. She would find wild onions and add them to their simple stew. They moved around each other with an intuitive grace, anticipating each other's needs, filling the empty spaces in each other's day without discussion. They were like two solitary trees that had grown so close their roots had begun to intertwine beneath the soil, drawing strength from the same earth, their connection hidden deep below the surface. The moment that changed everything came on a day of blistering heat. They were working together, replacing a rotten post in the corral fence. The work was hard, their movements synchronized. He would dig the hole with the post hole digger, his muscles bunching and releasing with powerful efficiency. She would clear the loose earth and help him position the heavy new post. The sun beat down, and the air was thick with the smell of hot dust and dry wood. Finally, he straightened up, wiping a forearm across his sweat-drenched brow. Ivy, seeing his exhaustion, went to the well. She drew up the bucket, the water splashing, impossibly cool and clear. She filled the tin dipper and brought it to him. "Here," she said, her voice a little breathless. He turned. his gray eyes dark in his sun-browned face. He reached for the dipper. As he took it from her, his fingers brushed against hers. It was nothing, a fleeting, accidental contact, but in that instant, the world seemed to stop. His skin was rough, calloused, and hot from the sun. Hers was cooler, softer. The touch was electric, a jolt of awareness that was more powerful than any embrace. It was the first time they had made contact since the desperate, violent intimacy of the fall from the train. This touch was different. It was not born of fear or necessity. It was quiet, and it was voluntary. Their eyes met and held for a long second over the cup of water. In his gaze, she saw a flicker of something she had never seen before, a startled vulnerability, a deep and quiet surprise. And he saw in hers not the fear of the hunted girl he had rescued, but the steady, open gaze of a woman. A universe of unspoken feelings passed between them in that single, charged moment: gratitude, respect, a deep and hesitant tenderness. It was a conversation held without a single word. He took the dipper, his fingers still warm where hers had been, and drank deeply. He handed it back to her, their hands carefully avoiding each other this time, and went back to his work. The spell was broken, but the air had changed forever. They finished the fence post in their usual silence, but it was a new silence now, humming with the memory of that brief touch. They had crossed a threshold. They were no longer just a protector and his charge, not just two survivors sharing a shelter. They were a man and a woman, living in a house that was slowly becoming a home, their affections sprouting quietly and persistently, like a wildflower in the desert, reaching for the sun. They lived as if nothing needed to be explained, because everything that mattered was already understood. The peace of the valley was a living thing, something they had nurtured from the dust and silence. It had grown in the weeks following Ivy's confession, no longer fragile but strong and rooted. It was a peace that had expanded to include two new souls, arrivals that had appeared one afternoon in a rickety wagon, like a memory Calder had summoned from his past. The old man was Raoul, his face a roadmap of desert suns and long years, his eyes holding a deep, unwavering loyalty. The boy was Tom, perhaps 10 years old, with a shock of unruly brown hair and a silence that rivaled Calder's own. He was an orphan, Raoul had explained in his quiet, Spanish-inflected English, a child of neighbors Calder had once known, left with nothing and no one. Calder had taken them in without a word of debate, his silent nod a promise of shelter. With them, the quiet ranch had blossomed into a home. Raoul's steady presence was a balm, his hands as skilled at mending a harness as they were at coaxing vegetables from Ivy's small garden. Tom, after days of watchful silence, had attached himself to Calder's shadow, his hero worship a palpable force. He followed him everywhere, mimicking the way he walked, the way he scanned the horizon. And to Ivy's surprise, the boy had slowly gravitated to her as well, drawn by the quiet warmth she offered. He would bring her a pretty rock he'd found, or sit silently beside her as she sewed, his presence a comfort, for the first time in her life. Ivy felt the fragile, tentative shoots of belonging. This small, broken collection of people was becoming a family. The storm returned on a bright, cloudless afternoon. The air was still, the sun a warm hand on the back of the neck. It was a day that held no hint of menace. Calder and Tom were in the corral, working with a young colt Calder had purchased from a distant neighbor. Raoul was in the small barn, mending a saddle. Ivy was on the porch, shelling peas into a ceramic bowl, the gentle thump-thump of the peas hitting the bottom, a peaceful, domestic rhythm. She was watching Calder, a small, secret smile on her lips. He was patient with the boy, his deep voice a low murmur as he explained how to gentle the nervous animal. It was the colt that sensed them first. Its head shot up, ears swiveling toward the high ridge that guarded the valley entrance. It snorted, its eyes wide with alarm. Calder went still, his hand resting on the colt's neck. He followed the animal's gaze, For a moment, there was nothing. Then, 4 figures on horseback appeared, silhouetted against the brilliant blue sky. They were not neighbors. They rode with the grim, predatory stillness of men who were not paying a social call. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, pierced the warm peace of the afternoon. Ivy's hands froze over the bowl of peas. She saw Calder's entire body change. The patient teacher vanished, and in his place was the hard, dangerous man from the train. "Ivy!" he called, his voice low but carrying with an urgent command. "Get Tom in the house, now!" He gave the boy a gentle but firm push toward the porch. "Go with her. Tom, do as she says." Tom, his face pale with a fear he didn't understand, ran, his small legs kicking up dust. He scrambled onto the porch, and Ivy grabbed his hand, her own trembling. She pulled him inside the cool darkness of the house. Raoul appeared at the barn door, his face grim. He saw the riders, then looked at Calder, a lifetime of understanding passing between them in a single glance. He disappeared back into the barn. Calder did not draw his weapon. He walked to the center of the yard, his hands loose at his sides, and waited. He was a mountain of a man, a solitary, defiant figure standing between the riders and his home. The 4 men rode down into the valley at a slow, deliberate walk, their horses' hooves muffled by the dusty earth. As they drew closer, Ivy's blood ran cold. The man in the lead, dressed in a smart city coat despite the heat, was Fletcher. Beside him, the hulking, brutish form of Grimes was unmistakable. They had 2 other men with them, hard-faced riders with the look of hired guns. Fletcher reined in his horse a dozen yards from Calder, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face. Well, the cowboy. I have to admit, I'm impressed. A jump like that, very dramatic. But you see, the thing about my employer, Mr. Thorne, is that he is a man of singular focus, and he wants his property back. His cold eyes flickered toward the house, and Ivy instinctively pulled Tom further behind her, away from the window. "She's not property," Calder said, his voice flat and empty of emotion. "And she's not here." Fletcher laughed, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Please, don't insult my intelligence. We've been tracking you for weeks. A man matching your description, buying supplies. A new colt. You've been building a life. It's almost quaint. Now, you can give us the girl and the satchel, and we'll leave you to your little desert paradise. Or, we can do this the hard way. Grimes prefers the hard way." Grimes grinned, a grotesque stretching of his lips that showed broken teeth. He flexed his hands on the pommel of his saddle. "The only way you're leaving is in a pine box," Calder said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. It happened faster than Ivy could process. Fletcher gave a subtle nod. One of the riders spurred his horse, galloping not at Calder, but in a wide arc toward the side of the house, trying to circle around him. Calder's hand blurred as he drew his colt, the sound of the gunshot shockingly loud in the still air. The rider cried out, clutching his arm, and his horse shied violently, unseating him. But it was a diversion. As Calder's attention was drawn to the first rider, Grimes had dismounted on the far side of his horse. He charged, moving with a speed that was terrifying in a man his size. He held no gun, only a heavy, weighted club in his massive fist. Raoul burst from the barn door, an old double-barreled shotgun in his hands. He raised it, but Fletcher was faster, his pistol already drawn. He fired once. The shotgun clattered to the ground as Raoul cried out and collapsed, clutching a bloody leg. Everything was chaos. Tom, seeing Raoul fall, screamed and bolted from Ivy's grasp, running out the front door toward the old man. "Raoul!" "Tom, no!" Calder shouted, turning toward the boy. It was the opening Grimes had been waiting for. Calder's head was turned for a fraction of a second, his focus on the endangered child. In that instant of distraction, Grimes was on him. The club swung in a vicious, whistling arc, It connected with the side of Calder's head with a sickening, wet thud. Calder's eyes went wide with shock, his body stiffening. He swayed on his feet for a moment, a great oak struck by lightning. Then his knees buckled, and he fell, face first, into the dust. He didn't move. A scream tore itself from Ivy's throat. The world tilted, the bright afternoon sun turning gray and cold. Her protector, her mountain, the man who was the center of her new world, was lying broken and still in the dirt. Fletcher dismounted, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. "See the hard way," he said, holstering his pistol. "Grimes, get the boy. You two, get the girl and find that satchel. Don't damage her too much." Ivy stood frozen in the doorway, her mind a maelstrom of terror. Grimes started walking toward Tom, who was paralyzed with fear beside the groaning Raoul. The other two men were advancing on the house, on her. The old, familiar instinct screamed at her. Run, hide, disappear. Her legs trembled, wanting to obey, to carry her back into the deepest, darkest corner of the house. But then, her eyes fell on Calder's still form. She saw the dust beginning to settle on his dark hair, the unnatural angle of his body, and something inside her broke. It was not her spirit that broke, but the cage of fear that had imprisoned her for so long. A white-hot rage, pure and clean, burned through the terror. They had hurt him. They had hurt her family. They had come to destroy her home. And Ivy, the girl who had hidden under a coat, the woman who had mended a shirt, decided that she was done running. She slammed the heavy wooden door shut and threw the bolt, the sound a loud crack of defiance. She turned, her back pressed against the door, her heart hammering. Tom was still outside. Raoul was wounded, and Calder. Through the window, she saw Grimes grab Tom by the arm. The boy struggled, kicking and crying. "Leave him alone!" Ivy screamed, her voice thin but clear. Fletcher looked at the house, an amused expression on his face. "Brave words. Open the door, little rabbit, or the boy gets hurt." Ivy's eyes darted around the room, searching for an answer, a weapon, a miracle. Her gaze fell on the fireplace mantel. Resting on two wooden pegs was Calder's rifle, a heavy Winchester he kept cleaned and loaded. It was his, an extension of his will, of his strength. Her body moved without a conscious decision from her mind. She crossed the room, her legs shaking so badly she feared they would collapse. She reached up and took the rifle down. It was heavier than she had imagined, the wood smooth and cool, the steel smelling faintly of gun oil. It felt alien and terrifyingly real in her hands. The men outside started to pound on the door. The heavy wood shuddered in its frame. From the floor near the barn, Raoul, propped on one elbow and clutching his bleeding leg, saw what was happening. "Señorita," he rasped, his voice tight with pain. "The boy!" Ivy's eyes met his across the yard. She saw his pain, his desperation, and his trust. She looked at Tom, his small face contorted with terror as Grimes held him. She looked at Calder, unmoving in the dust, and she knew what she had to do. Her whole body was a symphony of fear. A violent tremor ran through her arms, making the heavy rifle barrel waver. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. Tears of terror and rage streamed down her face, but beneath the fear, there was a new, hard core of resolve. She was no longer just protecting herself. She was protecting her home. She was protecting her family. She braced the stock of the rifle against her shoulder, the way she had seen Calder do 100 times. It felt awkward, wrong. She fumbled with the hammer, her thumb slipping twice before she finally managed to cock it. The loud, metallic click, a final, irrevocable decision. She peered down the long barrel, trying to align the sights, the world narrowing to a single point. The pounding on the door grew louder, more insistent. A splintering crack echoed as one of the planks began to give way. Ivy stood her ground, a trembling, weeping, avenging angel, holding the line, Beside her, unseen, was the memory of a flower pressed in a book, the feel of a warm hand, the taste of cool water in the sun. She was no longer a victim to be hunted. She was a defender, and the storm that had returned to her valley was about to meet the hurricane it had awakened inside her. The world was a maelstrom of light and sound and terror. The splintering crash of wood at the door was a physical blow, each impact shuddering through the floorboards and up Ivy's spine. Outside, the afternoon sun was a merciless, blinding glare, making the scene in the yard a tableau of harsh light and stark shadows. Her own breath was a roaring in her ears, a frantic, trapped thing. She could feel the rifle's heavy stock pressing into the hollow of her shoulder, cold and unyielding. Through the window, she saw Grimes tighten his meaty hand on Tom's small arm, lifting him slightly, using him as a shield. The boy's face was a pale, terrified blur. "Last chance," Rabbit Fletcher's voice cut through the din, sharp and impatient. Ivy's trembling grew more violent. The long, heavy barrel of the Winchester wavered. The sights a blurry, impossible puzzle. The girl she used to be was screaming inside her, a primal shriek to drop the gun, to run, to curl into a ball and wait for the end. The fear was a sickness, a bitter taste in the back of her throat. But then, through the wavering sights, her gaze caught on the still, dark shape lying in the dust. Calder. A wave of something hot and fierce washed through her, a current of pure, protective rage that burned the fear to cinders, the love she had never dared to name, the love that had grown in the quiet spaces between them, rose up like a shield. It steadied her hands. It cleared her vision. It silenced the screaming voice in her head. Her breath hitched, held, and became unnaturally still. The roaring in her ears faded, replaced by a sudden, preternatural clarity. She could hear the frantic chirping of a sparrow in the cottonwood tree. She could see the way the sunlight glinted off the silver concho on Fletcher's saddle. She saw the cruel smirk on Grimes's face as he gave Tom a little shake. That was the final catalyst. She didn't aim at Grimes. She didn't aim at the boy. In that moment of absolute clarity, she aimed at the ground just beside Grimes's boot. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion of the rifle was a deafening, physical concussion inside the small house. It was a sound bigger than the room, bigger than the valley. The recoil was a brutal, shocking punch that slammed her back a step, stealing the breath from her lungs and sending a starburst of pain through her shoulder. The room filled instantly with the acrid, sulphurous smell of gunpowder. Outside, the effect was immediate. The shot was so unexpected, so defiant, that it shattered the attacker's confidence. Grimes roared in surprise and anger, instinctively shoving Tom away from him and stumbling back, his eyes wide as he looked at the fresh crater in the dust where the bullet had hit. The boy fell, scrambling away on all fours like a terrified crab toward the wounded Raoul. The two men who had been battering the door froze, turning to stare at the house with a new, wary respect. This was no longer a simple matter of breaking down a door to get to a scared girl. The house had teeth. "What in the hell?" one of the men yelled. Fletcher, his face a mask of cold fury, stared at the house, his smugness completely gone. He had made a critical miscalculation. He had assumed the girl was a helpless pawn. He had not anticipated a defender. Ivy's ears were ringing. Her shoulder throbbed with a deep, pulsing ache, but she didn't drop the gun, fueled by a desperate, adrenaline-laced strength. She worked the Winchester's lever action. The movement was clumsy, foreign to her muscles, but she managed it. The sharp, metallic clack of the spent cartridge ejecting and a fresh one sliding into the chamber was the most decisive sound she had ever made in her life. It was the sound of her will, given form in brass and steel. She raised the rifle again. This time, there was less trembling. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but the resolve was a fire wrapped around it. She leveled the barrel, not at any one man, but in their general direction. A clear and unambiguous statement. Fletcher saw the movement. He was a pragmatist, a businessman of violence. He had been hired to retrieve a girl in a satchel, not to die in a pointless shootout in some forgotten valley over a cowboy and a surprisingly belligerent woman. The odds had changed. The cost had just gone up. "To hell with this," he snarled, making his decision. "It's not worth it." He swung himself back onto his horse. "Grimes! Get Collins! We're leaving!" Grimes hesitated, his brutish face contorted with the desire to charge the house and tear it apart with his bare hands. But he obeyed. He and the other man hauled their wounded companion, who was groaning and clutching his arm, onto his horse. Fletcher turned his horse to face the house one last time, his eyes burning with a cold, hateful promise. "This isn't over. Cowboy!" he shouted at Calder's unmoving form. "You hear me, Thorne always gets what's his." Then they were gone, spurring their horses up the slope and disappearing over the ridge, leaving a cloud of dust and a profound, ringing silence in their wake. For a long moment, Ivy didn't move. She stood with the rifle half raised, staring at the empty space where they had been. The silence that rushed in was heavier, more complete than any she had ever known. Then, the rifle suddenly felt as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. It slipped from her numb fingers, clattering onto the wooden floor. The strength that had held her up, the rage that had fueled her, vanished all at once, leaving her terrifyingly empty. A shudder racked her body, a violent, bone-jarring tremor of delayed shock. Her legs gave out, and she sank to the floor, her breath coming in great, gulping sobs that were devoid of tears. The sound was raw, primal, the sound of a soul that had been pushed past its breaking point and had somehow held. From outside, she heard a child's cry, "Tom!" The sound cut through her shock. She pushed herself up, her limbs feeling like lead, and stumbled to the splintered door. She fumbled with the bolt and pushed it open, stepping out into the brutal, accusatory sunlight. The scene was one of quiet devastation. Raoul was propped up against the barn wall, his face pale and beaded with sweat. His hand pressed against the bloody tear in his trouser leg. Tom was huddled beside him, weeping silently. But Ivy's eyes saw only one thing: Calder. She ran. Her feet felt clumsy, disconnected from her body. The short distance across the yard felt like a mile. She fell to her knees in the dust beside him, her hands hovering over his body, afraid to touch, afraid of what she might find. "Calder," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. He was lying on his side, his face turned away from her. A dark, ugly patch of blood matted his hair just above his ear. He was so still, terribly, unnaturally still. The mountain of a man who had been her rock, her shield, looked fragile, broken. "Calder, please," she begged, the words tumbling out in a frantic, desperate prayer. "Please, you have to wake up. Don't you leave me here. Please open your eyes." She reached out a trembling hand and gently touched his shoulder. There was no response. A sob caught in her throat, a sound of pure, undiluted anguish. She shuffled closer and carefully took his hand. It was limp in hers, but it was warm. The warmth was a tiny, flickering ember of hope in the cold darkness of her fear. She squeezed his fingers, trying to pour her own life, her own will, into him. "Please," she whispered again, bowing her head over their joined hands. A tear, hot and heavy, escaped her eye and fell, splashing onto the back of his dusty hand. Another followed, and then another, a silent, heartbroken rain. "I need you. Please, wake up." And then she felt it, a flicker, the faintest, almost imperceptible twitch of his fingers against her palm. Her head snapped up, her breath catching. Calder. A low groan rumbled in his chest, a sound of profound, distant pain. His head moved slightly, his face pressing into the dirt, and then his hand, which had been limp in hers, began to move. It was a fumbling, weak gesture, but it was a conscious one. His fingers slowly, painstakingly, curled around hers, his thumb brushing against her skin. The contact was a jolt, a current of life that shot straight to her heart. He was alive. He was responding. He was holding her hand. She stared down at their joined hands, his large, dusty one weakly gripping hers. The tears still fell, but now they were not tears of grief. They were tears of overwhelming, world-altering relief. And in that moment, as she knelt in the dust of the home she had just defended, holding the hand of the man who had given it to her, the final piece of her transformation clicked into place. The touch of his hand was the anchor point. It connected the terrified girl on the train to the trembling woman holding the rifle. She looked at his still form, at the wounded Raoul, at the frightened boy, and she felt the last vestiges of her old self. The girl who ran, fall away like dust. She had not run. She had not hidden. She had stood her ground. She had picked up a weapon and faced down the monsters. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would do it again. She understood now. She wasn't staying in this valley because it was a safe place to hide. She was staying because it was her home. She wasn't fighting because she was cornered. She was fighting for the family she had found here. And she was fighting for this man, for the quiet, steady protector who had shown her what it meant to be brave. She had chosen to stay, to fight, to live. She had done it for him, for the man she loved. The violent echo of the rifle shot faded, replaced by the quiet, desperate industry of survival. Getting Calder inside was a monumental struggle, a testament to the raw, sinewy strength of the man who was now as helpless as a child. It took all of Ivy's newfound resolve, combined with the grim, pained determination of Raoul, whose leg was a bloody mess, and the frightened but willing efforts of young Tom. Together, they were a broken but unyielding unit. They half-dragged, half-carried Calder's dead weight across the dusty yard and into the house, leaving a sorrowful trail in the dirt. They laid him on his own simple bed, the one Ivy had so carefully aired out weeks before. In that moment, the house transformed. It was no longer a sanctuary of peace. It became a sick room, a crucible where life and death would wage their silent war. The first hours were a blur of focused, frantic activity, under Raoul's pained, raspy instructions. Ivy became a field nurse. She boiled water, tore clean linen for bandages, and forced herself to look at the ugly, matted wound on the side of Calder's head. The sight of it sent a wave of nausea through her, but she swallowed it down, her hands surprisingly steady as she gently cleaned away the blood and dirt. She worked with a singular, fierce concentration, blocking out everything but the task at hand. This man had shielded her from the world's brutality. Now, she would shield him from the encroaching shadows of death. Raoul, his own leg bandaged tightly, sat in a chair, a shotgun laid across his lap, his old eyes watching the valley entrance. A stoic, wounded guardian. Tom, his tears finally dry, became Ivy's shadow, his small hands fetching rags and carrying away bowls of reddened water, his face a mask of solemn importance. A silent, desperate pact formed between the three of them. They would hold this line. They would keep him safe. The days that followed bled into one another, a long, slow river of quiet anxiety. Calder did not wake. He drifted in a gray, feverish twilight, lost somewhere between the living world and whatever lay beyond. Ivy's life narrowed to the small, shadowed space of the bedroom. Her world became a landscape of textures and temperatures, the rough wool of his blanket, the surprising softness of his hair, the searing heat of his skin when the fever was high, and the blessed, terrifying coolness when it broke. Her every waking moment was a ritual of care. She learned the geography of his unconsciousness. She knew the exact moment to press a cool, damp cloth to his forehead, to the back of his neck. She learned to listen to the rhythm of his breathing, her own heart seizing with fear when it became too shallow, her body relaxing when it deepened. She spent hours simmering broths on the stove, using the few herbs Raoul had taught her to identify, straining them into a thin, clear liquid. Feeding him was an act of faith. She would sit beside him, a spoon in her hand, and gently coax a few drops between his dry, cracked lips. Most of it would trickle away, but sometimes a swallow, a faint, reflexive movement in his throat, would be her reward. Each drop was a victory, a tiny anchor holding him to the shore of the living. In the long, quiet hours of her vigil, she watched him. She had only ever known the strong, self-sufficient, impenetrable Calder. Now, she saw the man stripped of his armor. She saw the lines of pain and exhaustion etched around his eyes, the vulnerability and the slackness of his mouth. She traced the faded white lines of old scars on his hands and arms, each one a testament to a life of hardship she knew nothing about. Seeing him like this, so utterly dependent, did not diminish him in her eyes. Instead, a new, fierce wave of tenderness washed over her, an emotion so powerful it felt like an ache in her chest. The protector needed protecting, and her love for him deepened, solidifying from a hesitant, questioning thing into an absolute, unshakable truth. They spoke little. Language was an intrusion in the sacred quiet of the sick room. Their communication reverted to the silent, intuitive dance they had perfected in the preceding weeks. When Raoul's leg pained him, Ivy would bring him a poultice without being asked. When Tom's quiet grief threatened to overwhelm him, she would place a hand on his small shoulder, a gesture of shared sorrow and resilience. On the fourth day, there was a change. The fever broke for good, and the unnatural heat left his skin. His breathing, which had been shallow and ragged, deepened into the slow, steady rhythm of true sleep. Later that afternoon, as Ivy was wiping his face with a cool cloth, his eyelids fluttered. She froze, her hand hovering in midair. His eyes opened. They were cloudy at first, unfocused, staring up at the ceiling. Then, slowly, they turned, and his gaze found her. For a long moment, there was no recognition, and a cold fear gripped her. But then, a flicker, a clearing. He blinked, and his eyes focused on her face. He knew her. He didn't speak. He didn't have the strength. But he looked at her, and in his gaze, she saw a universe of weariness, of pain, and a deep, soul-shaking gratitude. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, a soft, shaky sound of pure relief. "You're back," she whispered. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and his eyes drifted closed again. But it was enough. He had crossed the bridge. He was with them again. From that moment, his recovery was a slow but steady sunrise. At first, it was measured in the smallest of movements, the deliberate tightening of his hand around hers, the ability to swallow a full spoonful of broth. Ivy remained his constant shadow, his nurse, his guardian. The intimacy between them grew with every small, necessary act of care. She would prop him up with pillows, her arm around his shoulders, his head resting against her for just a moment. She would help him drink from a cup, her hand steadying his. These moments were devoid of all awkwardness, all pretense. They were simply two people, bound together, existing in a space where only the raw, honest truth of their situation mattered. They still rarely spoke. Words felt clumsy, inadequate for the emotions that flowed between them. A touch of the hand as she passed him a bowl. A long, shared look across the quiet room. These were the building blocks of their new language. His eyes would follow her as she moved about the room, and in his gaze she read a question, a need, a quiet apology for his weakness, her answering smile, or the gentle way she would adjust his blankets. Was her response, "I am here. It is no burden. I will not leave." About a week after he had first woken, he was strong enough to sit up in the rocking chair for a short while, wrapped in blankets. The evening was quiet. A gentle rain had begun to fall outside, a soft, drumming sound on the roof that washed the world clean. Tom and Raoul were asleep in the other room. The candle on the table cast a warm, flickering glow, making the small room a haven against the dark, wet night. Ivy sat on a low stool near his chair, mending a tear in one of Tom's shirts. The only sounds were the rain, the soft crackle of the fire, and the whisper of her needle through the cloth. She was acutely aware of him watching her, his gaze a warm, tangible presence. She finished her stitch, knotted the thread, and set the shirt aside. She looked up at him. His face was still pale and drawn, a bruise shadowing his temple, but his eyes were clear and deep. The silence between them was not empty. It was full, rich with all the things they had endured together. She thought of the girl she had been, a creature of pure, frantic fear. She remembered the terror on the train, the panic in the desert, the heart-stopping moment when she had seen Fletcher and his men on the ridge. That girl felt like a stranger to her now, someone from a different lifetime. The woman who sat here, in this quiet room, was not that person. This woman had faced down monsters. She had held the line. She had found a strength she never knew she possessed. The words rose unbidden, simple and true. She met his gaze, and her voice was a soft, steady whisper in the quiet room. "I'm not afraid anymore." It was a profound confession. She didn't mean the fear of Fletcher or of Silas Thorne. She meant the deep, abiding fear that had been the foundation of her entire life, the fear of being alone, of being worthless, of being helpless. That fear was gone, burned away in the heat of her decision to fight, and soothed in the quiet, healing days that had followed. A flicker of something deep and powerful moved in Calder's eyes. He understood. He knew she wasn't just talking about the attack. He reached out his hand. Not the strong, capable hand she knew, but one that still bore a slight tremor of weakness. She placed her own in it without hesitation. His fingers closed around hers, a gentle, deliberate pressure. It was not a gesture of passion, but of something far deeper. It was an acknowledgement, an answer, a promise. In that simple, quiet squeeze, he said everything he could not say with words I know. I saw you. I am proud. I am here. Ivy's heart felt full enough to burst. She returned the pressure, her fingers lacing with his. The rain pattered on the roof. The fire crackled in the stove. They sat in the warm, flickering light, hand in hand. Their silence a perfect, complete conversation. Their language now had no need for words. It was spoken in the quiet rhythm of their breathing, in the steady warmth of their joined hands, in the unshakable truth that they had found in each other a place to finally, truly come home. The seasons began to turn in the valley, a slow, majestic wheel grinding away the memory of violence and fear. The brutal, white-hot sun of high summer softened, its light taking on the golden, syrupy quality of early autumn. The air grew crisp in the morning, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine from the high country and the earthy smell of the curing grasses on the hillsides. The world was exhaling, and with its long, slow breath, a deep and lasting peace settled over the small adobe house. Calder healed. The angry wound on his head became a faded scar, a pale line hidden by his dark hair, a physical reminder of the day the world had tried to break them. But his true healing was deeper, a mending of the spirit that was visible in the quiet corners of his life. The hard, solitary shell he had carried around himself for so long had been shattered, not by the blow from Grimes's club, but by the fierce, unwavering care of the woman who had refused to let him go. The change was in the small things. Before, his silence had been a wall. Now, it was a quiet space he shared. He began to speak more, not in long speeches, but in small, necessary offerings. He would point out a hawk to Tom, his voice a low rumble. Red tail, see how he rides the wind. He would comment on the weather to Raoul, a shared observation between two men who understood the language of the sky. And with Ivy, his words were often questions about her comfort, his voice holding a new, gentle timbre. Are you warm enough? Is the load too heavy? Each question was a small act of devotion. He no longer looked at the ranch as a burden, a painful piece of his past to be sold and forgotten. He looked at it as a future to be built. He worked with a renewed, purposeful energy, not just maintaining, but improving. He and Raoul re-roofed the barn, their hammers echoing in the clear autumn air. He cleared new ground for a larger garden, turning the soil with the same patient strength he used to gentle the colt. He was planting roots, not just for himself, but for the small, unlikely family that had taken root around him. Ivy blossomed. The woman who had fought for their lives with a rifle in her trembling hands now wielded a ladle and a sewing needle with a quiet, confident grace. She was the heart of the home, the source of its warmth and its scent, the smell of fresh bread baking in the stove, of herbs drying from the rafters. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a clear, steady light. She laughed now, a sound that was at first as rare and precious as a desert flower, but soon became a frequent, lovely music in the house. It was often prompted by Tom, who had shed his own shell of silence and become a bright, curious boy, his questions a constant stream, his energy a whirlwind that swept through their quiet lives. Her love for Calder was no longer a secret, trembling thing. It was a part of the air she breathed, a certainty as solid as the earth beneath her feet. It lived in the way she would watch him from the porch as he worked, a soft, private smile on her lips. It was in the way she made his coffee just as he liked it, and in the way she would find his mended shirt laid out for him in the morning. She asked for nothing from him, no words, no promises. The simple, solid fact of his presence each day was more than enough. One late afternoon, when the sun was a great, molten orb sinking toward the western mesas, the day's work was done. A profound sense of peace lay over the valley. Raoul was sitting on the porch, carving a small wooden bird for Tom, the shavings falling like pale snow around his boots. Tom was inside, already asleep, worn out from a day of helping Calder. Calder stood by the corral fence, staring out at the land, his land. Ivy came and stood beside him, drying her hands on her apron. They stood in a comfortable silence for a long time, watching as the sky began its spectacular, nightly performance. The blue began to deepen to a bruised purple, and the edges of the distant clouds were set ablaze, painted in fiery strokes of orange, rose, and gold. I remember the first time I saw a field of these, Ivy said, her voice soft. She was looking past the corral, to a wide, sloping meadow that rose toward the hills. Earlier in the summer, it had been a sea of brown, thirsty grass, but the late-season rains had brought about a second, improbable bloom. The entire meadow was now a breathtaking carpet of wildflowers, purple asters, yellow snakeweed, and the delicate white petals of evening primrose. Calder turned his gaze to the field, and a small, almost imperceptible softening happened around his eyes. My mother loved that field, he said, his voice a low murmur. She said it was the valley's way of smiling. It was the first time he had ever mentioned his mother, another small piece of his past offered to her freely. Ivy felt her heart swell. She wanted to tell him everything that was in it, all the gratitude, all the love, all the overwhelming sense of peace he had given her. But the words felt too large, too clumsy. He seemed to sense her need. He turned from the fence. "Walk with me," he said. It wasn't a question or a command, but a simple invitation. She fell into step beside him, and they walked away from the house, their long shadows stretching out before them in the dying light. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The rhythm of their footsteps, falling in perfect sync on the soft earth, was a conversation in itself. They walked toward the field of flowers, a pilgrimage to the place of smiling. When they reached the edge of the meadow, they stopped. The air was cool and sweet, thick with the scent of the blossoms and the damp earth. The colors of the flowers were incredibly vivid in the twilight. A last, defiant burst of beauty before the night. The sky above them was a masterpiece, a canvas of impossible, bleeding colors. It was a moment of such profound and perfect beauty that it felt sacred, a gift. They stood side by side, their shoulders almost touching, watching as the last sliver of the sun disappeared behind the dark silhouette of the mesas. The world was awash in a soft, ethereal afterglow. Ivy turned her head to look at him. His face, illuminated by the warm, colored light, looked younger. The harsh lines softened. The guarded, weary man she had met on the train was gone. In his place was a man who was at peace, a man who was home, and she knew, with every fiber of her being, that she was home, too. She reached out and gently laid her hand on his forearm. The fabric of his shirt was coarse beneath her palm, and she could feel the solid, living warmth of the man beneath it. He turned to look at her, his gray eyes dark and deep in the twilight. Her voice, when she spoke, was a bare whisper, meant only for him and the vast, listening quiet of the valley. "At first," she began, her gaze holding his, "I only asked to hide beneath your coat. I just wanted a place to disappear. For a moment, I thought I would run forever." She paused, her thumb stroking the rough fabric of his sleeve. "Now," she continued, her voice thick with an emotion so deep it was almost painful, "I only wish to stand beside you, under the sun, or in the rain. It doesn't matter, as long as I am beside you, for all my days." It was everything. Her whole heart, her past, her future, all laid bare in those few, simple words. It was not a plea, but a statement of fact, as solid and real as the ground on which they stood. Calder did not speak. His face did not change, but a universe of emotion moved in his eyes. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the fragile girl he had rescued, but the strong, resilient woman who had, in turn, rescued him. He saw the woman who had faced down his demons and her own, who had filled his empty house with laughter and light, who had made his broken past into a foundation for a future he had never believed he could have. Slowly, he raised his hand and covered hers. His fingers were warm and strong as they laced through her own. He did not offer a grand promise or a flowery declaration. He was not a man of such things. His truth was in his actions. He simply held her hand, his grip firm and steady. It was a silent, unshakable vow. It said, "You will never be alone again. You will always be beside me." They stood there as the last of the color drained from the sky, and the first, shy stars began to prick the deep velvet of the night. Their hands were joined, two separate lives woven into one. The fiery sunset behind them was a testament to the end of a long and difficult day, and the rising stars were a promise of the infinite, quiet nights to come. No more words were needed. No promises had to be made. The promise was in the standing, in the holding, in the shared and silent journey forward, together. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and support us further by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.